Alright, welcome to another review. Today, I got something a little special. DPVR reached out to me and sent me their latest headset, the DPVR E4. Oh wow, that thing looks really bright on camera. I might need to adjust that. They sent me this headset for a review, and this is aimed at the more budget and mid-range crowd, which I think is important because that territory of the market has been almost entirely abandoned to Meta and Pico. Especially since the Reverb G2, rip to that, is basically discontinued, and you can't even buy it on the US HP store anymore. Two quick disclaimers. Firstly, I was sent this unit for free, and DPVR is letting me keep it, but that does not mean that I'm going to treat it with the kitty gloves because, oh boy, there are some nice things here, but there also are some rather deep flaws. So we're going to spend today talking about both the pros and cons. Secondly, DPVR is actively updating their software and firmware, sometimes quite significantly, and some issues I have seen earlier reviews complain about, such as the controller tracking, appear to have been significantly improved. So this will be covering where the product stands at this time. But it is still available for consumer sale, so if you bought it, that's what you're going to get, and I don't advocate buying things on the idea it'll get better if it's not satisfying now. And we're going to answer, is this thing satisfying now? One thing I want to point out right away, and most notable point of why someone may potentially buy this over, say, the Quest 2, is that unlike the current and upcoming mainstream options from the two data harvesting social media giants, this headset includes a native Displayport connection for uncompressed PCVR. Here's a quick spec sheet. There are a couple asterisks to add here though, like the headset does support 120Hz at native resolution, but it only does so on NVIDIA GPUs. If you are on AMD, you only have 90Hz. And that FOV claim, I'm pretty sure it's diagonal FOV. They also say it supports glasses, but my eyes felt so close to the lenses that I really would not recommend glasses with this thing, and I've heard some rather mixed reports coming from a couple other reviewers who did use glasses with this. But anyway, there's a good bit to talk about here, so I'm going to go down a couple points here and compare the E4 to the Quest 2, as I feel like that's the main competitor, and it's the one I have. I don't have a Pico 4 to use. I'll be starting with the positives before getting into some of the negatives. So let's jump into the setup and the software, because I think they did a mostly nice job here.
The setup and presentation is both nicely done and fairly easy to follow. You just install the DPVR Assistant, select a location to install, and then wait for the process to complete. There's a little video which plays while you wait, has some audio onto it too if you want. Even shows a brief segment for how you set up the room boundaries. Small touch, but nice little thing for a presentation. After that's done, it does prompt you to sign in, but this is not required. You can just use the visitor mode as the guest login. You also don't need to be connected to the internet, even in guest mode, so that's a plus. Once you're done, you get a brief walkthrough of the headset and the important parts on it, where to connect it, and just generally how to get it ready, which is a good onboarding process for people who are new to VR, and I think this is one of the better ones I've seen baked into the required setup process. Room setup was a bit finicky, as I had to walk around my room and spin my head around to get it calibrated, and that took a bit for it to register as done. You then have the software itself where you can adjust a variety of things, IPD included, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit because this headset has something a little different. Anyway, most of this is standard stuff, but the most important thing to know is the controller mode. For some games, you need to change the controller mode or else you won't get proper inputs, or sometimes they won't even track. Thankfully, DPVR has a rather extensive list to say what input method you need to select, and most do work with standard mode. But to change the mode, you have to close SteamVR, so it's a little inconvenient, but this is sometimes just how it is with niche headsets. Now, let's get into the main reason one may consider this over a Quest 2, the visual experience, as it does have a native DisplayPort cable. Starting with the field of view, I got 96 vertical and 94 horizontal on test HMD, which is good because the rendered FOV for the DPVR is 96/96. The stereo overlap is also basically complete going by the rendered here, but then also this measurement I did using WimFOV. Compared to the Quest 2, which got me 88 vertical and 86 horizontal, this is a decent bump, but still feels quite small. But I also have to note that this is because I am on the third IPD for the Quest 2, which seems to impact the FOV you get. I've seen people who who use the second or first IPD notch, and they seem to get around 94 to 98. Which means that, depending on your IPD and face shape, you may not actually see much of an FOV boost versus the Quest 2. But if you have the right head shape, then yeah, there's a slight but noticeable increase.
Speaking of IPD, though, so the DPVR, it features a entirely fixed lens design and only has software IPD offsets. You cannot physically move the lenses. Now, it says it supports 54 to 74 millimeters using this, but again, since it's a software-only offset, you might have some real problems depending on what your IPD is. I've used around 68 to 69 on every headset I've used except for one, and my IPD felt mostly fine here. I did have a tiny bit of trouble getting both eyes in the sweet spot at once sometimes, but it wasn't too bad. And I did also play around a lot with the software IPD offsets a bunch just to see if maybe it would be slightly different considering that. And the way you adjust the IPD is done by you look at an object in a program DPVR package and you adjust it until you feel the 3D effect is proper and you don't have any eye strain. Now, I didn't have eye strain, but I am really not fond of this kind of design. I much prefer mechanical IPD and being able to physically move the lenses exactly because there is only so much you can do with software. I have seen a few other reviewers have issues with IPD exactly because of this. To DPVR's credit, though, they seem like that they have accounted for this in the optical stack, and they've done a reasonably good job considering the limitations. As most reviews I've seen, again, it seemed like it did mostly work for them, though. But again, there is only so much you can do with software offsets. And if your IPD is too big or too small, you might have some problems. I don't know the exact distance that the lenses are affixed to here. It started at 64 in the software, but I don't know if that's because that's what they physically are at, or if it's simply because that's just 10 millimeters away from both the minimum and the maximum, and not where the lenses physically sit at, though. This feels compounded by the fact this uses Fresnel lenses. And I'm not sure if it's simply because of how the lenses are or due to potential IPD issues, but the glare and God rays on this feel a lot worse than the Quest 2. The overall clarity does feel reasonably close, but save for compression, we're going to look a little bit at that later though. But this is one factor where just the Quest 2 has it soundly beat. It's not as bad as, say, the Index or the Vive Pro 2, at least from my memories. But yeah, it's still rough if you're used to like the Quest 2 or something. I would even prefer a 3-step system compared to the software only this has with the IPD, and I would be curious to see if maybe that would help. This also uses the same panel as the Quest 2, so in terms of colors and the like, again, this is basically just a Quest 2 with a Displayport. The colors aren't that great, but they're passable. Blacks are also what you'd expect from LCD, but I mean it's a budget headset, so the trade-offs are pretty fair and expected. It's not a bad panel for what it is. But, so speaking of clarity, let's get to the main feature over the Quest 2, and again, that is the DisplayPort cable. I decided to do some testing between the DPVR and then the Quest 2 with both AirLink at its maximum, without adjusting debug tools that is, of 200 megabytes per second, and then Virtual Desktop Ultra with the recently released 10-bit high video encoding at its maximum of 150 megabytes per second. I also have a dedicated Wi-Fi 6 router with a physical Ethernet connection to my PC and modem inside my room. So I think I have a reasonably good environment to test with all this. For fairness' sake, and to eliminate as many variables as I could, I set the resolution for each step to be about as close together as I could. The DPVR here was set to 2728 by 2728 per eye, while the Quest 2 with AirLink was set to 2704 by 2736 per eye, or maxed out in the Oculus resolution slider. And then Virtual Desktop was left at Ultra's default, which corresponds to 2688 by 2784 per eye. Yes, it is a slight difference in pixel count, but it's not even a few % difference, so it shouldn't matter. All footage here will also be of the DPVR, as I'm still trying to figure out if I even can show compression properly on a recording. If I can figure that out, maybe I'll do a dedicated video analyzing it like I did with the anti-aliasing in VR.
So, first up, we have Skyrim. No upscaling used here, but I did use the LAA. And here, the compression was incredibly obvious on Airlink. All the foliage and detailed environments hurt my eyes to look at, like I was watching some 2000s YouTube video. Especially when looking out a great distance with a lot of grass. But between VD and the DPVR, it was closer. Virtual Desktop handled the compression noticeably better, but I could still see some slight problems in certain spots. It was still far more tolerable than Airlink, though. The DisplayPort cable on the DPVR made a slight but still noticeable difference here compared to Virtual Desktop, and a lot versus Airlink. Now, in Phasmophobia and testing dark places, it was a bit of a similar story. The differences between DPVR and Virtual Desktop with 10-bit were subtle, but I could still pick out some differences. I'll be honest and say, though, that if you're not pixel peeping or actively looking, I could certainly see some people overlooking any issues. Airlink also fared better here, and again, I bet some people could overlook it, but it's still a touch behind Virtual Desktop, and some banding on the lighting in particular was noticeable. Now, when it comes to air car at max settings, all three felt reasonably close, and it was surprisingly hard to notice compression artifacts from a short drive around. Airlink was still just barely behind Virtual Desktop and DPVR, where those two felt almost identical. Even when I got up to the highest point in the map to look down over the city like this with each headset, it was very hard to notice a real difference between Virtual Desktop and DPVR. But I could slightly see it with Airlink. Not really feel like the DisplayPort cable made too much of a difference here. I decided to then load up Space Engine and look at the Earth from the moon, since I once heard somebody mention it looks 16-bit on the Quest 2. And comparing all three in this scene, honestly, it didn't feel like there was that much of a difference to any of them. As for Resident Evil 8, which I tested on the upscaler branch with DLAA and DLSS quality, it was a moderate win for the DPVR over the 10-bit Virtual Desktop set. Bit more noticeable than in Phasmophobia, but not quite so much as Skyrim. But with Airlink, well, it was pretty bad. Close to how bad it was in Skyrim, and I had a measurably better experience with Virtual Desktop and the DPVR. Truthfully, Virtual Desktop when maxed out was shockingly good, and I'm amazed it came so close to wired DisplayPort. But there was still a subtle but meaningful difference having the native DisplayPort. Plus, you don't need to worry about the Quest 2's rather short 2-hour battery life that way. Funnily enough, though, one of the places where I saw compression being the most obvious was the Steam VR overlay with the game icon. I could see visible compression on every icon that simply wasn't there on the DPVR, but was on both Virtual Desktop and Airlink. However, this also said, I found some rather interesting results in Test HMD. On the DPVR, I could just barely read line 7 at 5 meters away at this resolution. It was about the same on Airlink. Line 8 was illegible. However, on Virtual Desktop, I could just barely read line 8 at the same distance, which means it was sharper than the DPVR despite the fact it had DisplayPort. But then when I tried with contrast adaptive sharpening from the VR Perf kit at 0.75, which is I believe the same amount that Virtual Desktop uses, the DPVR I could read the exact same amount as I could with Virtual Desktop. I thought it a rather interesting find. Moving on to the next segment, we have the tracking and the controllers, and this is probably where I have some of the most praise for the HMD. Starting with some shooters and Pavlov here, the DPVR E4's tracking performed pretty great, though not perfectly. During some shooting with a pistol two-handed, it felt great and I didn't have any problems with drifting or aiming. And when I moved on to a two-handed gun, the majority of the time, I could make accurate shots while aiming down the sights, and there wasn't any wobbling. This was also done without Virtual Stock 2, so it's all just in how steady I keep my hands on the controllers. Most of the jitter you'll see is just purely from my own hands, since it's hard aiming guns, and not from the tracking. However, as I said, it's not quite perfect. There are still a few spots where the tracking does fail briefly and starts to freak out when trying to shoot, as you can see right here. From some playing around, it appeared to fail the most consistently when aiming noticeably up, like when trying to shoot up the stairs right now. I sometimes had issues when aiming down from an elevated position too, but that was noticeably rare when compared to shooting upwards. Shooting dead on, almost no issues at any point though. As I have 3 inside-out tracked headsets, I decided to do a quick comparison in the shooting range using the same gun in semi-automatic mode from about 20 meters away. First up, we have the DPVR itself. I was aiming at the X on the dummy with virtual stock disabled and trying to control the recoil a bit, but not moving my hands much. Things felt fairly fine here, and I mostly aimed where I wanted it to be. At the end here, you can still see a few shots still went stray, but part of that's also just how recoil can be. Next up is the Pimax Crystal, where here you can see some points where it's kind of jumping around a bit. It's not abysmal, but it's definitely some moments where it's visibly obvious the tracking is drifting here and having issues. Still managed to land a decent spread, and I'd say it's usable, but probably would run into some issues. Moving on to the inside-out track king, we have the Quest 2. There was a small hitch at the very beginning where things went off track, but the tracking quality quickly corrected, and everything else was pretty on target. I was able to shoot without too much of a problem, and in the end, it had the tightest spread of all 3. Then I also did some testing in Blade and Sorcery, where I had 0 issues at any point in time, both when doing regular melee combat and swinging weapons, or blocking blasters from enemies in the Star Wars mod. It was really a great time and nothing to complain about. Oh, and don't mind the graphical glitches, waiting for some mods to update. Nothing to do with the headset. But in general, I think the tracking on this should do pretty great in most games, and you won't be disappointed. You also don't have to worry about the room boundary and floor height constantly being wrong. The DPVR gave me 0 problems with that compared to the much more expensive Pimax Crystal. It's not quite there with the Quest 2, but it's not a world apart.
And now the positive to okay things are out of the way. Let's get to the negatives, because oh boy, there were definitely some real shortcuts taken here, and some of those flaws are rather big ones. Firstly, we have the audio. This is the second worst part of the headset and uses integrated audio, kind of like right here, kind of like the Quest 2 does. But I will put it blunt, it's nowhere near as good. It is the worst stock audio I have heard in any VR headset. DPVR, however, does include some basic earbuds, which you can plug into the 3.5mm audio jack, which is on the back of the box right here. And it's a little bit of an inconvenient spot. And the quality on these is passable. Not great, not bad, it's passable. I still do think the Quest 2 is a little bit better, though. This is a budget headset, so I think it does make sense to skimp out on the audio a bit. You can upgrade your headphones, but you can't upgrade your screens. But even as someone who doesn't care much about audio, I'd still definitely encourage you to use your own headphones on this. It's just not good. As for the microphone, well, here's the thing. You cannot adjust the microphone volume in Windows. I've confirmed that with 2 different reps. You can visibly adjust the slider, but it sounds the same at volume 1 or 100, and it does nothing. And I have a very loud voice, so loud that I have had multiple people tell me I am the only person they have ever had to turn down inside a VR chat. I've had to turn down every microphone I've ever owned to around 40 to 75-ish in order to avoid issues with peaking. The DPVR is no exception here. The audio is not something I can really use all that well because of this and several other reasons. Namely the fact that it is so sensitive, it picks up even trigger presses on my buttons from the controllers. And also the internal fan within the headset, which does get kind of loud, by the way. And that gets picked up by the microphone when you're not speaking. I'll play a little clip right now of me just pressing record. So, the mic here just doesn't really work for me. In fact, let me demonstrate the mic problems if you have a loud voice. If you have headphones, you may want to turn down the volume just a little bit. You have been warned. I'm going to give you an extra second to turn your volume down just in case. Now that you can't blame me for not warning you, here's a clip I took when measuring the FOV. Alright, I can just barely see it. So, yeah, hope you understand my issues now. Yes, and I know you can do a lot of stuff with OBS and filters, and I do that with some of my own stuff, but I've never needed to do this for a VR mic to make it even at least passable. This thing's just way too sensitive and has some issues. The microphone also remains registered in Windows even when you turn off the DPVR software, whereas the headphones do disconnect, which I do find a little bit disconcerting. But now we get to the worst part. The part which makes this headset a total deal breaker for me to be able to use it for an extended period of time. The comfort. Now, I want to preface this with something, a little disclaimer, as I am about to get very negative. I hate Halo strap designs. I have tried multiple Halo strap designs, and I have hated every single one. PSVR 2, Bobo VR M2 Quest strap. Does not matter if they have a top strap or not. They have constantly been some of the most uncomfortable designs I have ever used, despite how people rave about them. So this is probably just a me thing that has to do with the face shape. But do you see what the head strap design on this thing is? It's a Halo strap. But this ain't no Angel's Halo. Oh no. So it should come as no surprise when I say I can't stand this. I've used over a dozen head strap designs, and most of them with and without counterweights. I have used over 10 different headsets for an extended period of time too. And this is the most uncomfortable head strap I've ever used. It is only the second time that I have ever been so uncomfortable in VR that I've thought, I don't want to keep playing after about 30 minutes of using it. And my tolerance for bad comfort, if the other features are good, is very high. There are just so many problems with this thing for my specific head shape at least. I have a big nose, which ends up with the lenses resting right on it here and digging into my nose badly, especially during any rapid movements where it bumps into them. DPVR, yes, did include some lens covers for it, but using those made it worse for me because it takes up more space. If I try to angle the headset in a way to avoid this, well, I have issues with being able to get both of my eyes into the sweet spot on the lenses, and the quality degrades noticeably. But then, the headset also just ends up so loose, it actually risks falling off me if I move too much. And my head is so big, it also barely fits the Halo strap. This is the furthest design. I turn this like that much, I can't turn it anymore. And I have to undo the top strap here to make it fit my head. And if I tighten the headset to try and get it to stay in place because I have issues with it being loose, it hurts my skull around the strap where it grips. But I have to do that or else it's just too damn loose. And to further hammer in the point, this thing has a flip-up visor design, which their advertising is that you basically, if you wear it, you can just flip up the visor, look at like your phone or your PC or whatever, and then just flip it back down, get right back in the game. But for me, that doesn't work. Because of how loosely this sits on my head, if I flip up the visor, this thing starts listing forward noticeably. So if I want to put the visor back down, I basically just have to readjust the headset entirely to get it to fit right. And it's actually more inconvenient to do it than just like lifting up my headset a bit and peeking through the nose gap here. But this does at least have pass-through, and thank God for that, so I don't have to use the flip-up visor part. The comfort was actually so bad, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to use this long enough to properly review it for the first 2 hours. I was dreading using it more solely because of that. It took me that long to find something that was even workable for my head shape for even long enough to like do a decent session. And even then, the comfort was just not good. I don't know if I would be able to use this for like a full long recording session of like an hour and a half, 2 hours or more. I spent so long over the several days I've been using this and just trying to get it to fit right and find something that was tolerable from like an Apache strap, from some counterweights. I couldn't get it to fit right and be comfy on my head. And this is why I think weight distribution and design matters more than just the raw weight. Because this thing is quite light. I believe they claim it's like less than 300 grams when you don't factor the top strap in, and the top strap does not feel heavy. I didn't have a scale which really could fit this thing to verify it, but it's a light headset. It feels like one of the lighter headsets I've ever held. But the comfort, just for that reason alone, even if everything else was stellar, I just wouldn't be able to recommend this headset if you have a big head or any issues with Halo straps. But as I've said, lots of people do love Halo straps, and I think I'm the only reviewer who's had this bad a reaction to the head strap. So what if we just set that aside as a comfort for the face shape thing? As most people do seem to find the DPVR at least okay, if not decently comfy. Is it still worth it then? Well, let's look at the price. So the DPVR retails for $549. Meanwhile, if we look at the other budget options, if you don't want to buy used because the used market can be hard to predict, right now we have the Quest 2 starting at $300, with the Quest 3 coming at $500 quite soon. It's probably not far away at all. And then you have the Pico 4 at €429 if you're outside the US or if you don't mind importing. There's also the Pimax Portals VR mode coming up, and that has a pretty variable price. But I don't know when exactly that's coming or the quality on that, so I'm not going to talk about it beyond this quick mention. Point is, if you're budget-minded, there's really not a lot of options. But unless you fit like 3 or 4 different qualifiers, that being something like you refuse Pico or Meta for ideological reasons like the huge privacy or tracking concerns, you refuse to get base stations, and your IPD won't be an issue with the fixed lens design, unless you're all that, I can't really recommend the headset. If it came out like a year and a half ago, perhaps it'd be easier for me to recommend it. But this has Fresnel lenses, a completely fixed IPD, a non-replaceable cable, by the way. You cannot change this out, and poor audio quality, and the Quest 3 is just right around the horizon with a higher resolution, pancake lenses, color pass-through, and it's cheaper, without considering any sales, that is, if you don't mind buying Meta. And if you don't mind buying used, you can find some great stuff in the $500 to $600-ish range. GameStop sells refurbished Valve Index kits for $600 in the US if you're fine with that. Although you're obviously going to get quite a visual downgrade, but you'll get audio, you'll get the base station tracking, you'll get mechanical IPD, those things. Some cost-cutting measures are expected, but it just kind of keeps adding up until there's some very noticeable shortcuts taken which just feel questionable. And I think that's too bad, because we really could use more competition in the budget to mid-range space. And stuff like the tracking, which seems to be quite difficult to get, DPVR did fairly well with it, at least at this time. And they're the only VR company I have seen who actually lets you buy an extended warranty, at least for the consumer end. And this is amazing in a place like the US, where even headsets several times costlier than this, like the Pimax Crystal, only come with 1 year of warranty and no way to extend it, at least without officially from the company, and you want your stuff to last. I wish more companies would do something like that. I can't comment on how good their regular support is, though, but they seem quite nice and responsive to me. But I am also big YouTuber influencer man, so I'm probably going to get some special treatment. But I still do hope they keep trying and refining their product instead of just giving up on this one. But this attempt, I don't think it's going to shake things up very much. This headset is just too late to the market with questionable compromises. If this was no later than early 2022 and the headset didn't have a fixed IPD, then maybe I would have an easier time recommending it, without so many stipulations, that is. That is assuming the comfort issue is just a face shape thing. But if you are one of those individuals who doesn't want base stations, doesn't want Pico, doesn't want Meta, and you want to take your chances on the IPD, and you're a DisplayPort snob, I'll include a link in the description, and a coupon code for $50 off. It's your money to spend and decision to make. But I would probably still think about it and go check out a couple other reviews besides just mine, just see how it is. It's definitely got some major shortcomings that can make it hard to recommend for some people. And that's the review. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought. Do you think this still has a place in the market and I'm wrong? Have you tried the headset yourself personally? Or maybe you feel like crucifying me for my opinion on Halo straps. Either way, consider sticking around if you like this review and seeing what I do in the future. If not, well, thanks for stopping by. Later.